It's my particular pleasure today to introduce our guest speaker, Dr. Michael Birrell. Michael has studied the ancient world, taking his BA degree with honours from the University of Sydney, before going on to a master's and PhD at the University of Macquarie in Egyptology. Michael has been involved heavily in teaching, both at the University of Macquarie, or Macquarie University, but also in the continuing education programs at a number of Sydney universities. Michael has also considerable experience in the field as well. He has participated in digs in Egypt and throughout the Levant. And I dare say, over afternoon tea, Michael will be more than happy to chat with you about his various fieldwork experiences. But also, since 1998, Michael has been leading archaeological tours of the ancient Near East and Mediterranean through his company, BC Archaeology Travel. This has included tours to Egypt, Roman North Africa, Morocco, Spain, France, Malta, Italy, Greece, Turkey, Iran, Israel, Lebanon, and many other places. And also, I believe, Ethiopia is on the cards in the near future.
Your commission's in the post.
Absolutely. Thank you very much, Michael. Brown paper bag would be sufficient, But without further ado, or indeed without further spruiking of Michael's companies, may I introduce the first lecture, which will be on the Romans in Egypt.
Thanks very much. Hi everybody, I'm going to give two lectures today. So the first one is going to be an introductory lecture on the Romans in Egypt, a general introduction to that subject. And then after afternoon tea, I'm going to talk about the Fayum mummy portraits, which are superb works of art from Roman Egypt. So this lecture, I guess, is an introduction, or if you like, setting the scene to explain those mummy portraits. I'm concentrating on the period from Cleopatra to the end of the 3rd century. I guess I've put Cleopatra to Constantine. I'm really focusing mainly on the archaeological evidence of the Romans in Egypt rather than the textual evidence, of which there is plenty. But we will mention some of those textual sources as we go along. The Roman involvement with Egypt, of course, became particularly an issue during the reign of Cleopatra VII. She came to power in 51 BC, and already the Romans were deeply involved in Egypt and obviously had their eye on Egypt as a prize. Because of its strategic location, located as it was in northeast Africa, it had control of trade coming from the east and also the west. So it was a central location, exceedingly rich in terms of mineral resources and agricultural resources. So the Romans were particularly interested in taking possession of it. And really, it was only a matter of time. Cleopatra, certainly during her time in power, made the most of her natural attributes, whatever they might have been, to try to win over, obviously, the famous Roman generals, Julius Caesar and Mark Antony, as we'll see. So, Romans' direct involvement in Egypt with armed forces take place for the first time in the aftermath of the Battle of Pharsalus in 44 BC, when Pompey the Great was defeated by Julius Caesar and fled to Egypt. Julius Caesar, of course, followed him with his forces, and that's the first time that Roman army forces are really entering the country, not with, at that point, an aim to taking possession of Egypt, but certainly their presence in Egypt was a step in a bad direction for Egypt, certainly that Egypt would increasingly come under Roman control during the Civil War period. Caesar, of course, landed at Pelusium and marched on Alexandria. He was following what had happened to Pompey the Great, discovering that Pompey had been beheaded just before he arrived. Caesar's presence in the great port city of Alexandria would have devastating consequences because Caesar would fight against the Egyptian authorities, and during those combat situation, unfortunately, the port caught on fire, and we are told by a number of ancient sources, including Plutarch, Aulus Gellius, and others, that much of the Library of Alexandria, the famed research institute of the Ptolemies, burnt, and most of the books were destroyed. So we have consistent evidence which points to this fact, that the library was largely destroyed at this point when Caesar was in Alexandria. And as we'll see subsequently, when Mark Antony and Cleopatra are living together, trying to form a new state, Mark Antony loots the Library of Pergamon and gives it to Cleopatra to replace the burnt library. So it's quite clear that the library had been burnt. Many of the estimated, well, we're told 400,000 scrolls in the Library of Alexandria had been damaged, and he took the Library of Pergamon in western Turkey and gave it to Cleopatra to try to replace that burnt collection. So the Roman presence in Egypt was, from its first period, was devastating. The loss of much of the library, devastating. We have been able, through archaeological investigation and by looking at what ancient authors such as Strabo say about Alexandria, been able to reconstruct something of the ancient city. I'll be talking about that in a moment from a Roman perspective. But let's just have a quick look at this map. So the most important part of the palace of the city was the palace complex in the Brucheion, which was this area here. The palace incorporated the library and the museum, the research institute of the Ptolemies. It's been possible through excavation, particularly in this area and underwater archaeology, to investigate some of these remains, and we're increasingly filling in gaps in our knowledge. But the problem with excavating Alexandria is that you have a modern metropolis overlying the ancient city. Very difficult to investigate in great depth. Alexandria would, during the Roman period in Egypt, from 30 BC to 320, if we want to put it in that frame, Alexandria was the administrative capital of Roman Egypt. It was the great metropolis, the city founded by Alexander centuries before, and famed, of course, for its research institute and the museum. The work of the revered scientists at the museum continued right through the Roman period. We have not yet been able to identify archaeologically any remains of the Library of Alexandria, but we do have textual sources that tell us about it, the layout of the disposition of the rooms, and this is a computer-generated attempt to try to reconstruct what it must have looked like. It was a repository of scrolls containing predominantly works in Greek, but also manuscripts of many other languages. We should keep in mind, certainly through the whole of the Roman period of Egypt, that the language of the administration, the language of the elite, was Greek. the language of the law was Greek, because Egypt had been under Ptolemaic Greek-speaking administration since the arrival of Alexander the Great. So in Roman Egypt, the vast majority of people, of course, were native Egyptians who spoke their native language. They started to write, they were certainly writing their native language in the Greek script, that is what became the Coptic language. But the administration was certainly in Greek, and the culture of the elite was Greek right through this period. Cleopatra and Julius Caesar had a son, Caesarion. But in addition to that, subsequently, Cleopatra VII would form an alliance with Mark Antony in an attempt to try to preserve the independence of her kingdom, and they would subsequently have 3 children, Cleopatra, Alexander, and Ptolemy. And they would, the living descendants of Cleopatra and Mark Antony would continue to play a part in historical events for the next 50, 60 years, which we'll have a brief mention of. So the presence of Julius Caesar, he stayed in Egypt some months before returning to the fray of the Roman civil wars, resulted in a child, Caesarion. He's represented here on the rear wall of the Temple of Dendera in Middle Egypt. So Caesarion is represented as the legitimate male pharaoh, the future king Ptolemy XV, and behind him is his mother, Cleopatra VII. She certainly had aspirations for her son, which were that he would become, when he came of age, the ruling pharaoh of Egypt and the continuator of the dynastic line. Unfortunately, he would be the last of his line, Caesarion. The death of Julius Caesar, of course, left Cleopatra in a precarious situation. She soon formed an alliance with Mark Antony. Mark Antony, of course, one of the leading generals of Julius Caesar, and subsequently a rival of the future Augustus. Augustus had tried to create an alliance with Mark Antony by marrying his sister Octavia to the general. And that was considered a good option to keep him loyal. But Mark Antony, represented on this coin minted in Syria, was taken in by the attractions of Cleopatra. It's always nice to be the ruler of one of the wealthiest kingdoms. It certainly makes you more attractive to be in that situation. Mark Antony broke with his brother-in-law, the future Augustus, and with Cleopatra planned to invade Italy, forming a naval force at Actium in western Greece with the intention of attacking Italy and supplanting Augustus. This is the Bay of Actium, where the fatal battle took place between Augustus, Cleopatra, and Mark Antony, the famous Battle of Actium in western Greece. It was a disastrous defeat for Cleopatra and Mark Antony, mainly the result of a loss of nerve on the part of those two. They fled back to Egypt, and the majority of the naval forces went to the bottom of the sea. Cleopatra, of course, had hoped that she would be victorious over Augustus, but fled back to Alexandria. Mark Antony committed suicide, and of course, so did Cleopatra. And this was taking place at the end of August 30 BC. The death of Cleopatra at this point was the beginning of the Roman period proper in Egypt. It left the way clear for Augustus to take possession of the country and to initiate a new administration. He made it a province of the Roman Empire, first making sure that her natural son by Julius Caesar was murdered. Caesarion was got out of the way as a matter of importance because he did not want a living heir of Julius Caesar around to act as a rival to his claim to Roman power. The dark green sections of this map show the areas that Augustus added to the Roman Empire. So he's expanding certainly his control by taking possession of Egypt. He forms a province out of the old Hellenistic kingdom and is very careful about the administration of this new province. It's far too rich, far too valuable, far too much an asset to permit the possibility that any rival to his power should take any kind of possession of it. So he makes it a custom that it is not to be ruled by the senatorial class, like many of the other provinces, but is to be a personal possession of the Roman emperors and is to be ruled by someone of equites class, middle class in Roman society. He establishes a prefect as the ruler of Egypt, and senatorial members are forbidden from entering Egypt. They are not to even enter the country. That was considered a treasonous act. So from the very beginning, Augustus is aware that Egypt is a valuable prize and it must be maintained by the emperor for his own security, and that's what he does. This statue in Cairo has been interpreted as a representation of Augustus in the guise of a ruling pharaoh. He spent some months in Egypt after the death of Cleopatra, forming the new government, forming the new administrative system of the country that he'd inherited. And from a local perspective, he was the heir to the old pharaohs, the heir to the Ptolemies in a way. So he's represented in a somewhat incongruous way as a ruling pharaoh wearing the nemes headdress of the traditional costume of the pharaohs and the other attributes of kingship. He and his successors will all be considered as pharaohs, represented as pharaohs, just the next dynasty, as many dynasties had come and gone over the millennia. One of the few things that Augustus really wanted to do while he was in Egypt, because he just spent a few short months making sure that everything was set up to his liking. He certainly didn't go south to the borders of Egypt, but he went to visit the grave of Alexander the Great, which was located in the Soma, the royal cemetery of Alexandria at the crossroads of the city. The embalmed body of Alexander the Great was still there, and we know that he went to see it, and he pressed the nose of Alexander, and it broke. He went clunk. He went, oops. We know that Alexander was still there, certainly until the time of Caracalla in the 3rd century AD, but then he disappears from history. So, don't poke. So Caesarion certainly murdered at this point. He was trying to flee Egypt but was captured and strangled on the orders of Augustus to remove this rival. The other three children of Mark Antony were taken to Rome to be brought up in the royal household of his sister Antonia, because they were the children of his sister's husband. And she brought them up in Rome. Subsequently, Cleopatra Selene would become a queen again of North Africa, a queen of Mauritania, by being married to Juba II. And she would have a living heir, Ptolemy, subsequently, and further descendants. So the bloodline of Cleopatra and Mark Antony continued for generations and may still continue down to this day. We don't know. It's possible. So Cleopatra Selene became this queen of North Africa. The new administration that Augustus established in Egypt was, if you like, replacing the old royal administration that had been the case under the Ptolemies. And if we have a look at this schematic, the control of Egypt in the Roman period was given into the hands of a Latin prefect. He's of the equites class, middle class, non-senatorial, and he has direct control over the province. His main concern is to maximize tax returns back to the Roman state. One of the things that the Romans did was to institute a poll tax for everybody over the age of 14. So every adult male and his family had to pay this new tax, which went into the coffers of the Roman state. The equestrian order, the equites of the Roman state, controlled all of the major administrative positions that you can see there. So these positions here are all imposed on the Roman state. They're outsiders and part of the retinue of the prefect. And the prefect can be appointed and replaced at the whim of the emperor. And that's the system that continued for a very long time. Underlying that upper administration, which replaced the Ptolemaic royal family, you've then got the lower echelons of the administration. One of the most important figures is the strategos, the administrator of a nome. So Egypt was divided into, it varied, but there could be 30 administrative districts called nomes, and the strategos was generally not a Latin-speaking Italian, but a Greek-speaking Egyptian. So a large percentage of Egypt, as a carryover from the Ptolemaic period, consisted of Greek-speaking foreigners. In some parts of Egypt, they could make up 30% of the population. So they were people that had come with Alexander. They had people who had come into the kingdom with Ptolemy I, with the foundation of the Ptolemaic kingdom. And they made up a sizable proportion of the state. They mainly lived in the big urban metropolises like Alexandria and some other urban sites, which I'll talk about in a moment. So they were the Greek-speaking elite of Egypt, and they controlled the provincial administration. The provincial administration was not under native Egyptian control. The native Egyptian influence was meagre and took the form of some magistrates, town councillors, and village elders. So Egypt is administered and is culturally Greek, speaking Greek. And in fact, very few Latin inscriptions have been found in Egypt, almost none. The vast majority of the administration, the whole administration of the provinces, was in Greek. And I'll show you some photos later on of a site that I worked on in Dakla Oasis, and we found a lot of papyrus in the house that we were excavating. It was all Greek, all legal documents were in Greek, all administrative documents, etc., in Greek. So that was the language that people spoke. The big city, the metropolis, the capital of the Roman province where the prefect would reside most of the time, Alexandria, is thought to have had a population of about 300,000 people, which for the ancient world was astronomical. It was in the 1st century AD that Rome's population was probably approaching 1 million, so Alexandria is up there as amongst the largest cities in the Roman state. It's a culturally diverse, very mixed population with lots of Jews, lots of Greek speakers from the broader Greek world, and only a relatively small number of native Egyptians living in the city. It was a port city and one that was very economically active. So the Romans were interested in controlling this port, controlling the resources of Egypt, and particularly controlling the grain reserves. One of the first things that Augustus did in setting up the province was to ensure that mass transportation of grain to Italy and particularly to Rome was the first priority of the administration. So the administration would ensure the transportation of grain to Alexandria and then its transshipment to Italy. It would take about a month for a boat to move from Alexandria to Rome. And as time went by, the Alexandrian grain made up a sizable proportion of the grain coming into Rome to feed the plebs. Ongoing excavation in the harbour of Alexandria is finding fascinating things because as a result of a series of earthquakes, the most famous one being in AD 365, the whole of North Africa lurched down some meters and took much of the palace complex and the port into the water. So it's all there. So it's been possible to do a lot of underwater archaeology in the port of Alexandria. It's mainly being done by the French. Emperor is working on that. So what they've been able to find are the inner ports of the ancient harbour, and we think some of the palace complex is actually quite well preserved and under the water. So that's an absolutely amazing find, and also these other port facilities and the remains, of course, of the lighthouse are being excavated as well. One of the main monuments of Roman Alexandria, of which we don't have a lot of evidence on the ground today, was the Caesareum. It was a monument that had been initiated by Cleopatra shortly after the death of Julius Caesar, and it was a temple dedicated to him. It was certainly fronted by 2 obelisks, and the ruins of the Caesareum were recorded in the drawings of early visitors to Egypt, and the 2 obelisks have ended up on the Thames embankment and in Washington, New York. So we have those 2 ancient Egyptian obelisks surviving. Of the Caesareum itself, we just have some description of those monuments, such as the writings of Strabo. One of the most famous Roman monuments, certainly in Alexandria, which you can still visit, was the Seraphim, the temple of the god Serapis. And the hill on which it was located still can be visited, and you can see some of the monuments that exist there. Serapis is an interesting deity. He's one of these syncretic deities from the Greek and Roman world. He's got has an interesting history because Serapis was designed by a committee. Ptolemy I asked his counselors, "Can you design me a god that will appeal to both my Greek and Egyptian subjects? I want to find some common ground." And what the committee came up with was a combination of Hades and Osiris. He's a funerary god, a god of the underworld, married to Isis. And that's why he appears with Kerberos, the three-headed dog of the underworld. So he's literally was sent to a committee, and that's what they came back with. He should look like this. He should be an older man with a beard because, gods are important and they should have big beards. And he wears a pot on his head because his realm is the realm of the agricultural world. He's a god of grain and of agriculture and of rebirth and renewal of life. So on his head is a symbolic representation of a grain measure that sits on his head. That's not a snazzy hat. It's so the Seraphim, located in the southwest corner of the city on a prominent location, it was visible from far away out to sea, was a colossal temple. The Ptolemies had built a temple here, but it had been damaged. The Romans, in the early Roman period, replaced it with this building, a monumental peripteral temple dedicated to this god, the funerary god Serapis and Isis. Unfortunately, in the early 5th century, it was totally destroyed and pulled down by the Christian residents of Alexandria, who completely obliterated it and destroyed the adjoining daughter library of the Library of Alexandria. So they destroyed those two buildings, and today you just have fragments of the building. What you do have is obviously foundations, but also this pillar, famously called the Pillar of Pompey, but actually it's a monument of the Roman Emperor Diocletian from the end of the 3rd century, and it was a colossal stone pillar on which the statue of Diocletian was originally located. So that's one of the Roman sites it's possible to visit in Alexandria. The problem of excavating in Alexandria is becoming more critical because of the massive population in the city. But it was possible, thankfully, to excavate in the 1970s this district of Alexandria, the Com-Edica quarter of the city. And what was found by the Polish mission was a fascinating array of Roman buildings from the center of Alexandria. This is very close to where Alexander the Great's burial must have been, in this quarter. So these buildings that have been excavated include Roman baths for the public, so quite sophisticated bathing complex for the city, with a cistern drawing or storing water coming in from Nile canals. There was also quite interesting Odeon and lecture complex, almost like an adult education complex, so it seems. So when you visit the Com-Edica site today, The Odeon will have been a general roofed theatre, not dissimilar in scale to this building that we're in at the moment, and it may have functioned as the town hall. It's right in the centre of Roman Alexandria, quite a sophisticated building. It certainly may have had that function for the Bouleuterion, the meeting of the town council of Alexandria. So, Alexandria, a very vibrant trade harbour, one of the most protected harbours in the world, and controlled by the famous lighthouse of Ptolemy I. That lighthouse continued to function, continued to stand for many, many centuries, certainly right through the period we're talking about, and was only destroyed in the 14th century when it collapsed. So it would have been a prominent feature of Roman Alexandria. When you visit Alexandria today, it's possible to visit many of the catacombs that lie in the outskirts of the city. These are sophisticated examples of communal burial places, not part of the tradition of the ancient Egyptians, certainly, but part of the Hellenistic and Roman tradition to have communal places for burial under the ground with facilities for feasting for the dead. And that's possible to visit these catacombs. This is one example. The most famous example is the Kom el Shogafa catacomb, this one. And as you descend into the ground, you reach a symposium room. It's from the Roman period, so members of the family would feast amongst the dead. Sounds a rather unsavory kind of thing to do, but they would lie on these clinae with tables full of food in this alcove and feast the memory of the dead. And they might also come back on the anniversary of the death of a relative and have a feast as well. So this is certainly not part of the Egyptian culture. It's part of the Greco-Roman culture. And some of the crypts for the dead opening off this massive communal space. Very interesting kind of syncretic art forms where you have traditional Egyptian subjects of the mummification of the dead by Anubis, but he seems to be wearing Roman clothing, and we see some other figures where he's wearing a centurion's uniform. So this quite interesting amalgam of Egyptian and classical subject matter. In Egypt, in the Roman period, there were there came to be four main metropolises where there were large Greek-speaking populations. The Alexandria, of course, was the capital, but there were a couple of other of these urban centres. This is Antinoopolis. So the other ones, so Alexandria up there, there were Greek and Latin-speaking populations at Babylon at the apex of the delta. Naucratis was a very important Greek-speaking city in the sense of ancient Greek settlement. Antinoopolis and Panopolis Ptolemais, this area here, was another metropolis set up by, most of them were set up in the Ptolemaic period. They housed Greek speakers from the Greek mainland, Macedonia as well, and they had the facilities of a Greek city-state. So Antinoopolis is a slightly different character. It's the only colony that was founded in the Roman period to be a new city. This city was founded by Hadrian to commemorate the death of his lover, Antinous, and he established a new city at the site where Antinous drowned in the Nile, and endowed it with all the facilities of a Greek city. It had, for instance, a stadium in the vicinity because the local population were Greek-speaking, Greek-thinking. The young boys went to the gymnasium and they competed in the stadium. So this was a city which was, if you like, an artificial colony of Greek speakers, some Latin speakers too, deep within Egypt, with a culture that was quite distinctly different from the culture of the native Egyptians at this time. It's a massive site and it's currently being excavated. There's a number of excavations taking place at Antinopolis. Egypt is and was certainly in this period, the whole economy was based on agriculture. That was the mainstay of the state. The Romans were interested particularly in the grain that they could get from Egypt. And the vast majority of people in Egypt, certainly the native Egyptian speakers, were illiterate, peasants working in the fields, giving a percentage of their crop to the state. The farmland belonged to the wealthy elite. A lot of it belonged to Greek-speaking families that had been in Egypt for centuries. And they tenanted out parcels of land to native Egyptians to farm, and those farmers would give a percentage of their crop to the owner, and he would have to pass on a percentage to the state. So the Romans were particularly interested in this commodity because it kept the mob compliant in Rome. One of the most famous regions of Egypt where agriculture was expanded and was of vital importance was the Fayum Oasis in northern Egypt. It was in Roman times and certainly in Ptolemaic times one of the breadbaskets of the ancient Mediterranean. Certainly a part of Egypt that saw many Greek and Roman settlers coming to Egypt to settle and take advantage of this commodity. So the Fayum Oasis is a natural depression just to the west of the Nile Valley, and it's actually fed by an old water channel, the Bahr Yusuf, which brought water into the depression during the inundation period. And it was a vast flat plain that could be cultivated. In the Ptolemaic period, many settlements developed around the edge of the agricultural plain of the Fayum Depression. If you see the location of them, they're all outside the depression, on the edge of the desert margin, above the flood levels. They were settlements established during the Ptolemaic period with colonizers coming from the Greek mainland and establishing settlements and taking advantage of the agricultural richness of the Fayum Depression. I'm going to talk briefly about one of them, Koranis, which is probably the best preserved of them. It's on the edge of the agricultural zone. These colonies in the Fayum Depression and other Greek-speaking settlements slightly further south, particularly Oxyrhynchus, are famous for the discovery of vast corpuses of papyrus, which have really given us lots of amazing discoveries of texts that don't otherwise survive from antiquity. And we've actually got some of the earliest surviving, certainly the earliest surviving fragments of Homer have been found in these settlements. Vast corpuses of documents have been found in the rubbish dumps in the Fayum. So people tended just to throw the old papyrus away. And archaeologists quite like rubbish dumps. They like going through people's garbage and finding out what they were writing, because they tell us all sorts of things about the economy, the administration, etc. So there are huge numbers of them. And I was lucky enough to be involved with an excavation in Dakla Oasis, where we also found vast quantities of papyrus that had been thrown away. So hugely interesting. These Fayum settlements are also the find spots for the famous Fayum mummy portraits, which I'm going to talk about after the break. A unique survival from the ancient world of these very magnificent portraits of living individuals that have come down to us. We'll talk about those after the break anyway. Quran is a major settlement of, it was already established in the Roman period, in the early Ptolemaic period. But in the Roman period, it really prospered, and it's thought that it had about 3,000 inhabitants living there. It was a large-scale excavation by Michigan. Am I running out of time? A large-scale excavation by Michigan has cleared a huge area of houses and temples to give us an impression of what one of these Roman period settlements would have looked like. We know from all sorts of data like that papyrus that I just showed you that probably we are talking about 40% of the people living in the Fayum were Greek, ethnically Greek, but we have to remember that they were there for generations, but they kept themselves apart from the native Egyptian population. So these cities are predominantly Greek-speaking settlements, definitely. And subsequently in the Roman period, they're going to keep there's this kind of status of foreign bubble, if you like. Karanis is famous for a number of temples. It has two major stone temples, both of which were revamped in the period of the Emperor Nero, mid-1st century AD. So these were prosperous little settlements, 3,000 people. They're spending money, certainly, and as I'll explain in a moment, the Roman authorities found it very useful to keep the native Egyptian population under control by supporting the priestly caste of native people who were the few educated, literate peoples amongst the native Egyptians. As long as they kept them on side, supported them with funds, contributed to temple construction, then they towed the line. It was in their interest to if you like, talk to people and convince them that the Roman administration was a good idea. So we're talking a stone temple in the Egyptian mold with a forecourt and the central shrine behind. This is both that temple and this temple are temples to the Egyptian god Sobek. Sobek is a god of travelers that you worship, and he takes the form of a crocodile. So this is another of these small but impressive Roman temples from the period of Nero. And again, well made, well constructed, and with a cult place in the inner sanctum for the statue of Sobek. There are very few, in fact, I think you could possibly say there is no evidence from Egypt of Roman deities per se being worshipped by Latin-speaking Italians. There's virtually nothing of that. So we do not, as a general rule, have representations of Jupiter, Juno, and Minerva, the state triad of the Romans, for instance, appearing in Egypt. What we do have are the native Egyptian deities for whom Greek equivalents were found. One of the most important temples in Egypt, and certainly one, the deity of whom found popular support throughout the Roman Empire, was Philae, dedicated to the cult of the goddess Isis, and her cult found enormous appeal throughout the Roman Empire, so much so that temples of Isis, of course, were founded in Rome and in many other parts of the empire. Philae lay very close to the traditional southern border of Egypt at the First Cataract, at Aswan. And the temple at the site was built by Ptolemy II and his successors during the Ptolemaic period, and was a very grand affair, and found pilgrims coming, certainly with the acquisition of Egypt by the Roman state. Roman pilgrims were coming to the Temple of Isis to leave an offering to this goddess. She's a goddess of fertility, of motherhood, and she found broad appeal, certainly. So in the Roman period, Roman tourists went to Philae to leave offerings. The First Cataract of Egypt had always been a logical boundary between the state of Egypt and the south. And in the Roman period, the decision was taken very early on in the reign of Augustus that the border of Egypt would just lie just to the south of the First Cataract, just to the south of Aswan. The main state that lay to the south was Meroe, a native black African state, which was a major military power that often had come up to the boundaries of Egypt and in many instances had actually taken possession of Philae, so had actually come beyond the First Cataract up to the First Cataract and taken possession of Philae. They too were worshippers of the native Egyptian deities, and at Philae, when you visit Philae, you can see a Meroitic lion. Two Meroitic lions are still there at the front of Philae. So this was, Philae was the natural frontier between Egypt and the Meroitic state. And the Romans placed a lot of emphasis on saying, it's ours. It's not Meroitic. It's now permanently to be part of the Roman state. So to cope with the hordes of Roman tourists who were coming as pilgrims to the Temple of Isis, the Romans constructed this forecourt in front of the temple, constructing these colonnades on either side and making that a large paved area where people could gather. Augustus also, or at least under his administration, is thought to be responsible for this beautiful shrine. It's actually a bark shrine used by the priests during processions around the island and off the island, where the statue of Isis would come to rest for a while. Traditionally, it was being called the Kiosk of Trajan, but we now know that in actual fact it's Augustus who, or it was in the period of Augustus that it was commissioned. And it's a beautiful piece of Egyptian-style architecture, originally with a wooden roof across the top. The actual frontier of the new province, the new Roman province of Egypt, was slightly further south of Philae at Kalabsha. And the decision was early on, must have been made, to make a real statement, to say to the Meroites, this is ours now, stay away. And Augustus and the administration took the decision to demolish the small temple, the small Ptolemaic temple that lay here, to build a new temple to the Nubian god Mandulus. It's quite a spectacular monument, has a big open courtyard and behind the main temple. And that's what it looked in its heyday, completely built in the name of Augustus. Probably in the earliest years AD is when it was coming into fruition. It originally lay about 40 kilometers south of its current location, but during the construction of the high dam and the flooding of Lake Nasser, it was moved to protect it. So the temple dedicated, as I said, to the Nubian deity Mandulus, but the pharaoh who appears everywhere is Augustus, and his name is written in cartouches. It's quite an exquisite example of late Roman, this is a late temple. There aren't that many new temples being erected in Egypt, entirely new, under the Romans. Mandulus can appear as a human-headed bird in Egyptian representational art. But here is Augustus wearing the traditional clothing of a native Egyptian pharaoh, and in his cartouches you can see the word autokrato. So he's being described as autokrato Augustus. The presence of the Roman imperial army was vital for the security of this province. We know that, according to Strabo and other ancient authors, that at various points in time there were 3 legions based in Egypt and later 2. One of the legions certainly was based in the north, not far from Alexandria, at the site of Nicopolis, and the other legion based at Luxor in the south, and its purpose was to secure, obviously, the region and keep an eye on the southern frontier. So you had a legion based in Luxor. We're looking at up to around 5,000 soldiers descending on Luxor. There is Luxor. And Nicopolis is just to the east of Alexandria, was where the other legion was based to protect Alexandria and the vital port trade. The legion in Luxor was centered in the town, and subsequently the legion came to have its base inside and incorporating the ruins at that point of the Temple of Luxor, which had been a cult place to the god Amun-Re. The old Temple of Luxor from New Kingdom period had been surrounded by an impressive mud brick wall. The Romans would make it their legionary centre, which I'll show you in a moment. In front of the temple we have this Roman shrine, quite a small one, built by Hadrian and dedicated to the worship of Serapis and Isis. So it would have stood close to the Legionary Camp, but outside the Legionary Camp of the Roman soldiers, dedicated to this famous cult, Serapis. The ongoing excavations around the Temple of Luxor, particularly in the last few years, have exposed quite a lot of this legionary camp. So it's been possible to reveal quite a large section of it is still there, preserved to some height, sometimes about 1.5 meters. So this is one of the entrances into the legionary camp, and the wall of the legionary camp runs under this public space in Luxor. And this is a reconstruction of what we think the legionary camp will have looked like in its heyday. It had 4 main gates giving access to the camp. The legionnaires who lived within the camp lived in relatively simple and not well preserved buildings, but the wall around the camp is extremely well preserved, particularly in its late form, the form that it had in the 3rd century AD. So there's the little temple of Serapis, and in front of it. What is a very interesting find is the legionary shrine in the center of the temple, which I'll talk about in a moment. So there's one of these entrances leading into the camp with the Roman archways giving access to the center. The central part of Luxor Temple was converted into a Roman cult place by the construction of a Roman apse. This is not Egyptian architecture at all. It's obviously classical architecture with the presence of Corinthian columns on either side. If you look carefully there at the apse, what you actually see is quite an interesting fresco that's been preserved down to today. And the fresco preserves evidence of, or representations of, the tetrarchs, Diocletian and his fellow rulers who ruled the Roman state for 30 years, from 275 onwards. So we have this fantastic representation of the ruling Roman emperors. And the implication from the construction that was located here, we certainly get the impression that this was the location where a statue of the emperors, probably the Emperor Diocletian, would have been put up. And in the early 3rd century, during the Diocletian attacks on Christians, it would have been necessary for someone accused of Christianity to come to this place and make an offering to the image of the divine emperor at this place. So you would have had the cult image of the emperor. I'm running out of time. What's interesting about the fresco is how well preserved it is, considering it's been out in the elements for so long. And it's recently been getting a clean. These frescoes represent the royal court of the Roman state, surrounded by the Roman emperors. So I'll be very brief. I briefly wanted to say that the Roman imperial system were sponsors of temple construction, and many of the temples that you visit in Egypt today were completed under the Roman administration. Komombo, for instance, has a courtyard completed in front of it by the Emperor Tiberius. Komombo there. Sacred crocodile of Sobek, where the mummified Sobek is buried in the surrounds of the temple. The Romans added this colonnaded court in front of the shrine. That's the court you see there. And it's Tiberius who is making an offering to Sobek, the Roman emperor, Tiberius. So his name there in cartouche. He's called, it's actually spelt out as Tiberius in the hieroglyphs. And the second cartouche says Caesar in hieroglyphs. So that's the Roman facade. Also of Roman date, this fascinating and unique representation of medical equipment dating from the reign of the Emperor Trajan. Komombo was a healing temple, and people came to Komombo to receive medical treatment, and this is a rare representation of the kind of implements that would have been used in this period. But I think I have to call it quits. You all need a cup of tea. And then when we come back at 3, I suppose? 10 past 3, I'll talk to you about the Phaon portraits. Thanks.